And welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, we are finally ending our Bubble Watch talk, at least for today, with the Big Ten. Now, I really like the complexion of this conference, right? Because compared to the SEC, it's going to put in about an equal amount of teams. There's a lot of depth and, most importantly, experience in the Big Ten to rival all the SEC contenders. But my big question about the Big Ten is that out of all the locks, is there one true team that can emerge as a championship contender out of all the teams projected to make it? Because the Big Ten is all about putting teams into the tournament this year, all about producing tournament-level teams. But are they championship-level teams? Tune in and find out now. Because this Big Ten, right, is battle-tested, all the teams beating each other up, but I feel like, in my mind's eye, if I'm the Big Ten, I do worry that even with all the talent, even with all the teams that we're putting into this tournament, I can't necessarily pinpoint one that separates from the pack, one to rival other conferences' best teams. But I do think that because of the depth of this conference, there could be a lot of teams that could separate from the pack come tournament time. But for now, it's a little bit of a mess in determining how real some of these teams are right now. But let's start off with the locks and then work our way down. And then we'll get into some of the disappointments, especially in the Big Ten, although there are very few. Now let's start off with the locks, because all these teams, right, and you can definitely say there's something similar about them to what we talked about with the Big 12, in that they could be over-reliant on one or two individual players, or they have depth somewhere but not enough elsewhere. But I do think that in terms of the Big Ten, they're just a little bit above the Big 12, because I do think that experience will matter down the line for the Big 12, and they just have a little bit more of it to me. Let's talk about the top contenders here, starting off with the Purdue Boilermakers. They had a 7-game winning streak snapped by another team we're going to talk about in a short while in the Michigan Wolverines. But to me, this Purdue Boilermakers squad isn't necessarily the same as the one with Zach Edey in it, but they still have the talent there in the backcourt, especially with Braden Smith and Fletcher Loyer, to get the job done. It's just about guys like Trey Kaufman-Renn and Camden Heide up front producing for you down low. But I do think that this team is sneakily balanced enough to at the very least make an Elite 8 run. But there do seem to be too many questions compared to when they had Zach Edey then than there are now. So that's why Purdue could be a complex team to monitor in the coming weeks. Then let's talk with the team that just beat them, the Michigan Wolverines. One of my favorite duos to watch in college basketball, Danny Wolf and Vlad Golden. We're going to talk about Danny Wolf a little bit later in the show, but he is a chameleon. He can play two different positions in terms of the guard and the forward position and dominate you during both. He's an elite passer. He's an elite finisher. There are questions about his ability to score from the free throw line and his defense, but when he gets going, he's an elite player, and Vlad Golden complements him beautifully. They could be a tough out, but outside of those two guys, they have the depth necessary, right, to make a big run. Because having elite big men is a special thing in college basketball, but I don't know if it's enough for this Michigan Wolverines team. Then let's talk with the Illinois Fighting Illini. This is a very interesting team, in my opinion. They have a tough test, I believe, in a couple weeks' time against Duke at the Garden. They have several lottery picks to look out for, but ultimately, I feel like when you're relying on freshmen to carry you, if you're Illinois, that's dangerous, because this Illinois team last year was one of the most experienced teams in college basketball. Now it's one of the most raw. And of course they brought in transfers to try and supplement it. But I feel like Illinois is starting to lose their luster in my mind a little bit. I love both Will Riley and Kasper Jakachonis, but it's going to be difficult for them going up against fellow freshmen who I feel are a little bit more elite than them down the line in the NCAA tournament. But we'll see, right? Their first big test in the regular season is against Duke. If they play well there, then chances are my mind changes about this Illinois team. But for now, I highly doubt that a team led by two elite yet not necessarily lackluster, but not necessarily the greatness of a Cooper Flagg and, say, a Con Kneppel on Duke, or even an Igor Demine on a BYU. Those kinds of players, I need to be convinced by Jakachonis and Riley, and I don't know it from there yet. Then Maryland, UCLA, and Oregon, they're all in a very similar boat. Very balanced teams, and I think health more than anything matters for them. UCLA had a couple of injury woes early on in the season, and Mick Cronin is talking about how a lot of these players need to perform even when their fellow players have gone down. So I don't necessarily know about that. Both Maryland and Oregon aren't necessarily as convincing as they would be to me in prior years. So I really think that if you're looking at the Big Ten as a conference that could potentially produce a championship contender, it's going to have to come with the experienced teams like the Purdues and the Michigans of the world, and potentially Wisconsin Badgers team. They've lost a lot of talent, but I like a guy like Max Klesmit and John Tonye to lead this team in the NCAA tournament. So I think experience is going to be what carries this Big Ten conference in the NCAA tournament, and is their best chance of producing a championship contender. Now let's go down the line here and talk about some of the teams on the bubble, but most likely should be in. Let's talk about this Ohio State Buckeyes team who have a very important game against Michigan. Definitely not as big in terms of college football rivalry, but still could potentially see them vault into lock territory. But this Buckeyes team I really like. But let's look at the 10 losses here. They do have 10 losses, but it's against a tough schedule. They're 4-9 against BPI top 50 opponents, but the remaining schedule could help them a little bit with Michigan and Indiana, a fellow bubble team potentially to come. But I do think that this Ohio State Buckeyes team falls into the individual player category. Bruce Thornton is their bell cow. I really like him, but I don't necessarily know if there's enough depth outside of that to carry them. Maybe Aaron Bradshaw down low steps up, but I don't necessarily know if this Ohio State team, like some other teams already in lock territory like Maryland, Oregon, and UCLA, can go deep in this tournament. So Ohio State's a big question mark to me if they vault into lock territory with a couple big wins down the stretch. And then a Nebraska team that has a top 40 ranking in terms of strength of record and wins above the bubble. They're at 78% currently on the ESPN forecast to make the tournament. I feel like this team just needs to play above its standard, right? This is a team that I feel has the talent to go far in this tournament, but they just come up a little bit short against the elite teams in their conference. They had a chance against Michigan at home, came up a bit short. They were currently on a 6-game losing streak, then they went on a 4-game heater. That hot and cold nature of their play kind of worries me. They do have talented players. They have Umar Ballo down low. Malik Reynaud is a fascinating forward. Mackenzie Mbako can get going at any time. So this Indiana Hoosiers team really is a team that can rev up its engines, but also slow down a little bit. And so I feel like this Indiana team is definitely going to have to start convincing people and pundits and analysts that it actually can compete in a loaded Big Ten. but they still control their own destiny here. And outside of Purdue, they don't really have that tough of a schedule. They close the season, like I said, with Ohio State. So we'll see if Indiana can convince enough to potentially get out of the bubble range and into more of the lock territory. Then let's talk about the disappointing teams here. Let's talk about the Penn State Nittany Lions, and more importantly, my father's own Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Let's start off with the Penn State Nittany Lions. This is a team led by Ace Baldwin, who a lot of people were expecting to have a lot of hype surrounding them this season, but have not produced and have kind of fallen down the rankings almost all the way outside of even the bubble picture. At the very least, Rutgers has the pedigree, potentially in my mind, to be a bid stealer in this conference just because of the two players in Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey who can lead this team at any given moment. But Penn State, man, they just have fallen from grace. But now let's talk about this Rutgers Scarlet Knights team, because it did not come together like a lot of Rutgers fans would have liked it to, even though Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey have been just as good as advertised. I think a lot of people could blame the fact that Dylan Harper has fallen ill very often this season, and Ace Bailey himself has had to deal with a couple injury worries and concerns, but I just think that it's the depth around them that's lacking. Jordan Durkak and Lathan Somerville aren't necessarily the kind of players, as Tap to Learn also agrees that both of these elite freshmen have missed too much time, that can't necessarily supplement these two talented stars. And if these stars are, like Tap to Learn has said, miss too much time, there's no cohesion in this roster either. So that's what has failed Rutgers at the biggest time. But their saving grace could be the conference tournament, because that's the only way I can see any quote-unquote bid stealer coming from a very loaded conference at the top. So let me know what you think about the Big Ten Conference. Let me know what you think with some of the failures and disappointments in the Big Ten this season, especially teams like Penn State and Rutgers. But coming next, we transition more into talk about the players in some of these elite teams and how their draft stock has risen over the past couple of months, but also how it could plummet come the postseason as well. We'll be right back after this short break to discuss it.